As I mentioned at the start of the show, we have a guest in studio. We have Senator Bob Hall, Texas State Senator Bob Hall. He represents the Senate SD, Senatorial District 2 here in the great state of Texas. He is a favorite among conservatives around the state because he is always willing to stand up and speak up for what he believes in, kind of regardless what's politically trendy or acceptable. He stands up for what is right, and the conservatives, for that reason, simply appreciate him so very much. I asked him to join me in studio today because I want to talk about what is happening in contact tracing in Texas, why there is great opposition in Texas. I want to dive in deeply and talk about why people are opposed, what would be involved, first of all, why people are so opposed to it, what are the reasons it's of concern, and then to find out his other thoughts about what we need to do politically to perhaps resist contact tracing. So, without further ado, welcome to Senator Hall.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you very much for having me on. I appreciate it very, very much. This is an issue that is of great concern, not just to me, but to all liberty-loving Texans and Americans. Because it's not just here in Texas, but that's the one where we have a concern for it.
It is. I want to have you just tell us. So tell us what the basic system is. In Texas, by the way, if you lost track of this, Republican majority. We have Republican governor, Republican leadership, Republican majority, House and Senate. So you can't even blame the Democrats for this. Tell us what the system is that's being proposed or is actually beginning to be in place in Texas.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say that it is not the government's responsibility to protect our health. Our government's responsibility is to protect our liberties. And just because you have the right to do something doesn't make it the right thing to do. And there is never, ever the right time or the right way to do the wrong thing. And contact tracing fits that perfectly, because contact tracing that's kind of the new name. It was called contact tracking, but they did a poll and people didn't like being tracked. But they did another poll and it was okay to be traced. And so they decided to rename it as tracing. But the concept, it's been with us for a long time. It was first introduced back in the early 1900s when that's how they found Typhoid Mary, who was running around the country and they couldn't figure out what it was. Well, that's how and it has a place. It has a place when you are trying to corral things like Ebola, TB, HIV, STDs, things that are very deadly but move very slow and are not highly contagious. None of those are. And so it makes sense to try to box that in and you can stop it. But what we now know, and I say now know because, as you well know, this all started with the government and the media misleading us with bad information about how deadly the virus was and how we would be overwhelmed in our hospitals. I think they were predicting that Texas would have 240,000 people dead by August, which means we'd have about 100,000 dead by now. People would be dying in the streets.
In the whole country, yeah.
No, in Texas. No, the prediction was for Texas.
Okay.
And huge numbers. But what we've realized is, as of last week, I believe, unfortunately, and every death is serious, but we had about 1,500 that had died. But in the same time frame, we'd had 7,500 die of the flu. And so
wait, I have to stop. In Texas. 1,500 died of COVID-19,
yes.
7,500 of the flu.
That's right, and or more, because it's not a reportable death. That's an estimate.
Wow.
Because it's not reportable. I think we've had about that many die of a heart attack also. So the point is,
wow.
And this is something to get to a little bit of the background of why I was so concerned. Both Jefferson and Hamilton talked in Federalist 1 and 2 about government and the trade-off between liberty on one end of the spectrum and government security on the other end. And we'd always have that battle, and there'll be those folks who tend to want to have all their security come from the government, and those who would prefer liberty and make their own decisions. And so my perspective is from the liberty end, that the government's role, as I said, is to protect our liberties, not to protect our health. And so with this, starting when they scared everybody, the whole objective was to scare people to death. They were projecting
Yes.
a 7% death rate. We're now finding that it's somewhere around 0.26, between 0.4 and 0.26.
Under 1%.
Well under one,
Well
way
under
under
one, yeah.
1%.
Yeah.
And we also led us to believe that it was an equal opportunity virus. That is, it didn't matter your age, your race, or anything about you, it would attack equally to everyone. But we now know that's not true. Matter of fact, none of what they said in the beginning is true. And being with my military background, I kind of refer to things from like we experience in the military. Battle plans are made by a staff that have nothing to do with actually fighting the battle. But when you go into battle, you've got a plan, but once the first shot is fired, if the battle commander doesn't adapt to the enemy's tactics and firepower, he's going to get beat. And that's what we have failed to do. We are still operating today as though this is something that's going to kill everybody equally,
yeah.
and that it has a very high death rate. And so what we need to do is adjust what we're doing to what the threat really is. And what we're finding is that 80% of the people that have died are over 60 years old. And most of those have had an underlying condition such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, something to have excessive sugar in their system. Those under 20, less than 1%, which means it makes no sense at all for us to have our schools closed at all. And we need to address the nursing homes. In Texas, at least 50% of the deaths are in our nursing homes. And I say at least 50% because that's the recorded number. What I did find is that if a person is in a nursing home and gets transported to the hospital and dies, it doesn't count as a nursing home death. And so it's even greater.
Oh, okay.
So we need to have our focus where the problem is, not causing businesses and people and others that are in a low risk. What we need to be doing is telling people this is what the facts are. Now, you make your decision on what risk you're willing to take in this. But the contact tracing in this program, as you said, makes absolutely no sense at all. This is kind of like it's like trying to bail a boat out with a sieve. The sieve has a good purpose in sifting flour, but it makes a terrible bucket for bailing water out of a boat. And that's what we have a contact tracing. Primarily, it would have made a little bit of sense if we had instituted this on day one back in February or January at that time. Today, because of the asymptomatic folks out there, which nobody knew anything about that when it began. Asymptomatic, for those known, those people that have it that don't even know they have it, or they don't get sick, or they don't have symptoms that are enough for them to think is something other than they just kind of feel bad. But a huge number don't have any, but they are spreading it just like everyone else is that does. So if we talk about this contact tracing, it's done when someone goes and gets a test conducted. The lab determines, oh, they tested positive. And so they will be contacting the contacting center in the government, who will then call the person to then interrogate them on where they've been, who they've been around, what they've been doing, and tell them about their need to isolate or quarantine. And there is a difference within our government on what the level of so-called volunteer is. The governor has said that it's all voluntary.
Our governor in Texas.
Our governor has said it's voluntary, but when I talk to the people that are in the government that are going to be implemented, their interpretation is that it's voluntary so long as the people volunteer. And if they don't volunteer, then it will become mandatory.
Right.
And it's just kind of like what we're just now seeing is that we're not going to put people in jail for not wearing a mask. But now we're going to put businesses out of business if they allow people to come into their business not wearing a mask.
I should jump in. I want to mention that because I haven't mentioned on the show before. We were talking about before we get started today. But today, in our great state of Texas, we have the governor who's been kind of surprisingly oppressive in terms of dealing with the spread of coronavirus and COVID-19. I've contrasted several times with his conduct with the conduct of Governor Kristi Noem as one example in South Dakota, far more respectful of the individual right to freedom. But back to Texas, Governor Abbott today, there was actually a letter, you may have seen this, Senator Hall, but there was a letter from, I think it was 9 mayors asking Governor Abbott, would you please, Governor Abbott, order people to wear masks. Give us authority to punish them if they won't wear masks. Governor Abbott said, well, I can't do that, but you mayors, you could order that businesses in your jurisdiction, your businesses must require a mask of people entering, or you can punish the business. And so the whole idea of, so he's essentially saying, yeah, I can, in this kind of, I can run around the problem, sidestep the problem, but eventually the notion is forcing people to wear masks, which is just the whole government coercion point I want to get to. But I want to have you finish describing, though, how contact tracing works. So you have a test. So what if you just refuse to have a test? Then they can't.
Well, if you don't have a test, and the point most people understand is the big push for testing is questionable even in itself, because that test is only good for the moment you take the test. You could contract the virus before you even get home that night. But let's say you test it. We still have a huge number of false positives and false negatives, so it's even questionable how valid those tests are. But if you do test positive, then they're going to contact the tracking center. The center is going to call you and then ask you, where have you been, who have you been around, where'd you go, and what did you do, and so on. And oh, by the way, you're going to need to quarantine. And that's 2 parts. So let me talk about the first. Okay, where have you been and what have you done? If you ask the average person where they've been, they're going to say, well, I think maybe I may have had lunch at a Chili's restaurant on Monday, or no, did I go to the library on Tuesday, or was it Wednesday? I went to the library. Not sure where they're going. I said, how is that going to be of any value? Oh, well, this is what I was told by the word, and I'm not reading this on Facebook. I'm getting this directly from the people that work in our state government that told me, oh, well, we will have the businesses keep a log of who's in there at what time and where they sat. And that's been confirmed now, because I've had several people call me and tell me, I went to a such and such restaurant and they demanded that I provide my driver's license to them so they could record my name and address and phone number.
It's actually happening in Texas. Wow.
Okay. It happening right here in Dallas, and it happened in Austin, and I don't know where else the other people were, and asked me about this. And I've tracked it down to where I believe this direct order was coming from the mayors, which concerns me a great deal. Of now we have mayors enforcing law that's never been passed by our legislature. We have laws, that's a whole nother subject in the thing. But the point is, we're talking about the only way they'll be able to do this is if they keep a log of the people of where they were, so they can then contact them. And when I ask them, well, it's voluntary, when they say, yeah, they can hang up on us, they don't have to answer. And I said, okay, that's okay, volunteer on that first person, but how did Jane Brown or Joe Smith, that happened to be in the restaurant the person went to, when they get the phone call, how did they volunteer their name to now be in a database and into a system in this thing? And that's when I don't get an answer for that piece of it.
And so that piece of it, so say you're the one they call and say, hey, you were at such and such restaurant and 6 feet away from you or less was so-and-so, and so what if you respond? Are you also at that point to say, I don't really want to talk to you, I'm not going to answer you, or can you hang up?
Yes, that's what I'm told you can do. But what I found already, I've already had constituents call me and said that I went and got a test and the test came back negative. And then they called and told me that their test was questionable. I need to come back in to be retested, but I didn't want to do that. So they called my employer and told them that I had been in there for it and what had happened, and he should not allow me back into work until I went back and got the test.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, this is not stuff I've read on the internet. This is people calling me that I got it in writing from them that they actually did this to them. So my concern are these rogue mayors and rogue, and it's not all of them. We have a lot of really good mayors, but it only takes a few that all of a sudden have the power. We saw it in one of the counties, recall, where the mayor was wanted to have a couple arrested because both the husband and wife went to Walmart, and he said only one of them needed to go to Walmart at a time.
Yep.
That kind of silly nonsense of people get drunk with power and doing that. But let me get on to, before we run out of time, over where it gets really kind of hairy, is the side of, okay, you've got it, now we need the isolation or the quarantine side of it. And they said, well, when we talk to the folks, we're not going to ask personal information like their bank account or stuff like that, but we are going to want to know their living conditions. Like it concerned if it's a family of 5 living in a small two-bedroom house, maybe has some small kids in it, or an elderly person where they're not going to be in one bathroom, they're not going to be able to quarantine or isolate in the house, then we're going to have government housing available for either the elderly person, the kids to go into, or something that, not being specific about who would have to leave the house, but we would have, and I asked a question, I said, now this is voluntary? And the answer I got is, well, we would hope they would volunteer. And I said, does that mean it would be required? And said, well, we can do that. And I said, where in the world do you think you have the power to do that?
Yes.
And this is where the shocker came. We already have it in law. We have it under the Contagious Disease Act that our local health officials can require the quarantine of someone if they feel that they have a contagious disease. So that exists already, and as I said it, I remember that is correct, and it is a valuable tool when you have something like Ebola or someone who goes out and purposely is trying to infect other people. It has a place, but it does not have a place here in this that we use. Now the other side is other people within the government, I've been told we would never do that. We would never use that. It is going to be all voluntary. I just have a concern that when we have things like we just talked about of the mask issue, when we get into this and people aren't volunteering, that the next step is going to be to make it mandatory. But the bottom line is, when I also asked the question, okay, we kept talking about the things we were going to do because we wanted to flatten the curve.
Yeah.
Now, most people didn't understand, flatten the curve does not reduce the number of deaths. It just spreads the deaths out over a longer period of time.
So you have hospital beds available.
So they had hospital.
Yeah.
Well, we have stayed well under 2%, maybe just went over 2% of our hospital capacity. And of course, we prevented thousands and thousands of Texans from getting needed medical care like breast cancer surgery and knee surgery and prostate cancer surgery, while hospitals sat empty or closed or laid people off while we were waiting for the COVID patients who never showed up. And we are yet going to have to pay the huge price, those people are, of not getting that medical service when they needed it. It is going to catch up with us. But I am concerned that we will lose sight of what we're supposed to do. The bottom I was getting to is when I said, okay, how many deaths is this going to prevent by doing this? So what are the metrics? How do we know what the 4,000 people spending $300 million with a company that's never had a contract bigger than $2 million? How many deaths is that going to prevent? Well, we don't look at it that way. We just look at it as it's something we should be doing. And then I kept trying to get back to the metrics. I'm an engineer, so I measure things that if you can't measure it, you don't know whether you're accomplishing anything or not.
I was going to mention for our listeners, the 300 million number comes because in Texas, the government happened to contract with a company named MTX for $300 million to put the whole contact tracing system in place. They're the ones who are in charge of it all. It was an expenditure, never went through the legislature, and there are people questioning whether that should have had more of legislative input, even if it was money available for emergency funding.
That is correct, and that's just a portion of the money. We now have several agencies. As of 2 weeks ago, the number that we had hired was something like a little over 2,800 people were involved from Texas A&M, University of Texas, something called AmeriCorps, and 4 or 5 other groups that we issue contracts that are in the millions, tens of millions of dollars for them in addition to what we're doing with this contractor, which is highly questionable about them, and it's highly questionable about how they got the contract, because they have never done anything like this before. They had less than 200 employees, most of which were in Bangladesh, and they were at the same time taking on contracts for similar work with 16 other states, which means if they do similar there, what they're doing here, they would have to have an employee increase in a month's time of over 38,000%. And I can't imagine any company being capable of building up like that or doing something. And the big concern with them is all the private personal data of individuals that are being tracked and where they're going and what they're doing and their history going to be on computers that we have absolutely no control over.
But hackers will.
Yeah, I mean, the state cannot even protect its highly sensitive computers within the state, and now we're going to have individuals and companies involved in this that we have no idea what they're doing or how they're doing it, but they will have individuals' private data that nobody should have.
Okay, I want to do a top-level summary of the kind of concerns so far you've raised about contact tracing, because it's a massive topic. But number one is that there is a seeming willingness of the government to, or assertion of authority that they can impose quarantine on people, and if the people do not seem to be cooperating, unclear, they're talking about having the authority to take people out of their homes. You've been told to quarantine because you were at Joe Blow restaurant and you came in contact with someone. They could remove either the grandma, the children, or the person who's quarantining. So it's a forced thing there. You're describing unjustified based on the actual death rate as compared with other extreme diseases. I mean, the death rate, we all were duped really by the data that came from that Dr. Neil Ferguson. It wasn't Oxford, Imperial College London, that had the dramatic predictions about death rates, and so everyone jumped into high gear. We've now had within 2 or 3 weeks, we realized the data was completely incorrect. No one's adjusted the battle plan to the facts on the ground. So we're still responding to bad data from the beginning, and contact tracing is all about the idea of limiting the spread, but now they're saying they can't really calculate what numbers, your last point, they can't really calculate the numbers of people who would be protected by the use of contact tracing.
And particularly since it doesn't make any sense, understanding that the only people who will be able to track are those who go get tested and test positive, and for each one of those there may be a dozen or 2 dozen people that are asymptomatic that are out there spreading it. And so it's like we got 20 people out there spreading it, but we're going to spend time and money and think we're doing something meaningful tracking one person out of it.
Yeah. So in fact, that was one point that I made a few weeks ago, and it really dawned on me, like in the middle of talking about all of this, unless you make it 100% mandatory, it's pointless. It can't work. You either have to make everybody comply and everyone gets tested, or there's no purpose to it at all.
No, but what more important, Debbie, is what our government ought to be doing is providing the information about who is susceptible, how it's spread, what you can do to protect yourself, and let the people make their own decisions on what level of risk they're willing to take. It's like they do every day. Somebody gets up in the morning, they make a decision on the risk they're going to take in getting in their car and going somewhere. Like coming over here, there were people who will take the interstate, the freeway, to come over here. There are others who will come on the side roads because they don't like they think it's too much of a risk for a wreck. They make a risk decision. Everybody makes that decision, and that's what we ought to be doing. That's called liberty.
So it's the foundational principle. I'm completely in agreement. The foundational principle of liberty, people make their own decisions. The government's job is to inform you so you understand the data. And actually, for people who are particularly susceptible, if you're being told that by the government, you understand, you say, you know what, I may have underlying conditions, I may be vulnerable, but I still would rather go out and live my life. You're allowed to make that choice. That's a choice you can make at liberty. You can. But so say we agree it has limited efficacy, this contact tracing. But what's and it's really, polling is showing this. It's Republicans, conservatives who don't like contact tracing, and Democrats more willing to, well, okay, if that's what they have to do, it's fine with us.
Actually, there are Democrats that are just
there are
as
some.
opposed. Yes, there are.
I'm just saying polling, saying that. But go ahead.
No, there are Democrats that have expressed a great deal of concern about this being somehow used against people that by the government.
That's what I want to turn to then. So, assuming we agree it's not efficacious or not reliably efficacious, and because of the nature of the way it spreads in the air, and it's an awfully big expenditure of money and dubious expenditure of money, but what is the liberty threat to having this system, as long as it really, what are the concerns conservatives have about the data being collected? What's so bad about all this?
What business is it where you've been and what you've done? That is nobody's business.
Tracing your life.
That is right. It's all of a sudden you're now under a microscope where what you've done now in this time period is going to be in digital form forever, because things electronic are forever. They live forever. So you as an individual, once you decide what it will do, this will drive people away from going to be tested when they should, because they don't want to be tracked. So they won't have people getting tested like they should. They won't go. It's just like what happened. We had people that would not go to the hospital when they needed to, because they were afraid they were having heart attacks, and not going to the hospital because they thought they were going to get the COVID, because the government had led them to believe if you get the COVID, you're going to die before the sun comes up.
Yep.
No matter who you are, no matter what your age is, no matter what your race is, that's what the government led people to believe, and so they wouldn't go take. So now we will have this with this tracing. People won't go get tested.
Yep.
And so my concern is the next thing is going to be mandatory testing, which will be a precursor to mandatory vaccines.
Yes. Right.
So it all links together in this, and a great deal of this, I believe, has been with government seeing how much more can we suppress liberty and people still tolerate it. And unfortunately, I think they're finding that they can suppress liberty a fairly significant amount as long as they keep making people feel secure. It's kind of like how Khrushchev explained socialism. Do we have time for me to explain how he did that?
Go ahead.
He was talking to a group in a farmyard, and while he was talking, there was some chickens running around. So he reached down and he picked up one of the chickens and held it under his arm, and he kept talking. And he reached over and he started pulling the feathers out of the chicken. He's pulling them out one at a time, and he started pulling more out and more, and he's pulling them out by the handful. Chickens screaming and hollering and bleeding, but he's pulling them out, and he finally gets all of the feathers out of the chicken, and the chicken's just screaming and hollering. He sets it down on the ground. Then he goes over to the feed bag over there and grabs a handful of feed, walks over by the chicken and drops a little feed in front of it, and to feed the chicken, and then takes a couple of steps back and a little more. And next thing you know, he's got the chicken following him all the way across the barnyard as he gives him a little bit of food. No matter as bad as he treated that chicken, just treat him a little bit nice with some food, and he follows him anywhere. And that's kind of what our government's been doing to us in there, just beating us up. So that we'll feel real good when they stop beating us.
I will say, I think one of the repercussions, and you're alluding to it, one of the extreme repercussions of all of this is the change in the cultural expectation, the political climate, that what your relationship is to government. You assume I live in liberty, and if I want to be tested, I will. If I don't want to, I won't. But over time, and because of fear, and because of political pressure, and really societal pressure, there are people in our culture who are mocking and demanding about how other people behave. We kind of surrender the standard of liberty, the presumption of liberty, and it's our culture is being shifted over into, we are a government-controlled society. As long as I do what I'm told, I'll be safe. And we seem to be going along with that. We don't have time to get into it, but I agree with your notion about the concern we have with the seeming pressure toward getting people to agree this is a horrible problem. We all have to. We have a whole new life. Life has changed forever, and we're going to get out of this by getting around ultimately to a vaccine, which flies in the face of, I've had on my show Dr. Robin Armstrong and Dr. Yvette Lozano, both of whom have treated COVID-19 patients and still are with complete success, with hydroxychloroquine and a couple other things they add with it. The point being, it's curable with a medication presently available and not even expensive, but that is being suppressed too. Well, we need to do more time on this. I want to ask you one more question, because these friends of ours, our mutual friends who've been saying you got to get Senator Hall on, is what do you do as a Texan if you don't want to be part of this? How do you resist?
Well, I think we could, we just resist. And, a few months ago, we had just about every county in Texas put together a resolution making their county or their city a Second Amendment sanctuary. I think we could do that for those liberty-loving cities and counties. So people get their city council and then their county commissioners to pass a resolution saying we will not participate
in contact tracing.
In contact tracing, and just said, no, if you're going to do it, you're going to have to do it. We will not enforce it. We will not do it. And I think that's what we need to do with all of this other oppressive government rules that are coming down that are stifling our life, particularly this thing that I'm just learning about, the mask. Knowing that the facts are that wearing a mask for an extended period of time will deteriorate your health, it will deteriorate your immune system, and the single biggest factor that's coming out of who gets the COVID are people with a suppressed immune system. So we're now requiring, just like we're
suppressing their immune systems.
Well, just like we did when we told people to stay indoors.
Right.
We had caused the spread of the COVID by having people stay indoors, whereas if we'd allowed them to go outside and just get in a little bit of sunshine during the day, or if they were told them, stay away from people, but stay out, it's okay to go outside, we would have probably had far fewer cases. And I'm just afraid we're coming up with rules that are counterproductive.
Okay, we need about another hour. I think we need about another hour. There's so many. I've been talking about this issue, of course, many times in my show, and had talked about experts and played clips from other experts talking about. And I was calling it house arrest for the healthy. If there's something wrong with you, why are you forced to stay home? But we've been through that, and it's just become kind of the cultural expectation. Everyone goes along with this. Everyone agrees to this, even though doctors around the country have been saying, we're handling this all wrong. We shouldn't have done this to start with. We should be, as you say, protect the vulnerable, let the healthy live their lives. Government's job is to inform, not to keep you safe from disease. But it's been an amazing experiment in America's willingness to simply surrender. And I think for many people, it's just hard for them to imagine that the disease was so alarming at the beginning, or the reports of the disease were so alarming, and the numbers that people just surrendered to all of it. But I actually think there's much more waking up happening than the government might want. Think so?
I think you're absolutely right on that. And there's a lot more on this to talk about.
Okay, we'll have to do this again. Well,
okay.
I will be back to you.
I would love to.